Girl, you know I can't wait till you start back. Because everyone misses you at the office. Besides, someone needs to keep Norman in line. Oh, did I tell you? They opened up a new shoe store down the street from the office. When you get back, we'll have to go check it out.
Who cares about new shoes?
As soon as you're back.
It's only been 2 months.
And you know what else? You're right about Steven. He asked me out on a date
Can
last
she
Friday.
just sit there and act like nothing's happened?
I'll give him some time. What do you think?
Why does she understand
Rose.
what I am going through?
Rosie.
Oh, yeah, that's nice having a new shoe store right around the corner from the office. When it opens, we'll have to go sometime. Check it out.
Did you know that every fingerprint is different? Even identical twins who naturally have identical DNA have unique prints. In many ways, your grief is like a fingerprint. It's unique.
And just as you leave fingerprints on the things you touch, grief's touch leaves a unique print on you. That's why, as you grieve, you'll face challenges that others won't.
In our last session, we shared some of the unique factors that influence your grief. Today, we'll continue that discussion. We'll explain how your relationships, past and present, can complicate your grief. Welcome to Grief Share.
For some of you, reminiscing about your loved one is comforting, but others of you may find it difficult or painful to reminisce.
You grieve relationships that were far less than perfect. They were painful.
I didn't have a happy childhood. My mother was a very strong disciplinarian, and I resented that. I didn't understand why'd I have to get beaten, whooped for everything in life. So I carried this anger, and after she died, you know, if Mama came up in conversation, I would just remember all the nasties, all the feelings and all the things that weren't fun, and I would recite them.
Conflicted relationships are grieved differently.
If you're grieving one, you need to be prepared for what to expect.
In any relationship, there's some ups and some downs, and that's just the reality of life. You know, even when you think about the funeral and they're going on and saying all these wonderful things about the person who died, if that's not been your experience and you had some difficult times with that individual, you may feel a little conflicted as you sit there saying, you know, who do I talk about? You know, who do I talk to about the fact that, you know, we fell out last time I talked to this person, or they weren't that nice to me. And so as you're going through the process and you're experiencing all these emotions, it's just important that you deal with what you feel in that moment.
You know, sometimes people who had complicated relationships maybe were on the brink of thinking they were going to end the relationship, or who just really didn't like a lot of things about their spouse, think that they don't really have to grieve because now their problem is solved. Now this person is not here. So that really is a fallacy. All of the things that have layered in the relationship that are problematic or that were conflictual really have to be worked through. People that have had relationships that have been troubled have often a lot more regret, a lot more guilt, a lot more anger to deal with than somebody who had a more traditionally happy, healthy kind of relationship.
Our response to loss is definitely based on the choices that we make, and it's not just the choices that we make at that moment, but it's the choices that we've made up until that moment. It's the choices that we've made in the relationship with the individual that we've lost. It's the choices that we've made based on issues of forgiveness and reconciliation. When we experience the loss, it's the choices that we make right then and how we handle our grief and how we process it that will carry us into the future.
And one day God looked at me and he said, honor your father and your mother. And I said, but she's dead. He says, no, you honor your father and your mother. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. she's dead and I'm not honoring her. And from that day on, I don't talk about the negatives. You know, that was a good healing thing.
Part of that healing process for me is realizing that my Heavenly Father meets those needs that my earthly father couldn't meet. In other words, not looking for something from your loved one that is past that you'll never get from them.
And so I think that, for example, when we can put our arms around a Heavenly Father that we know loves us, and one way to do that for me, because see, I couldn't do that with my own dad. I never got to hug him. I never got any I love yous or bless you or good job, son, or any of those kinds of things from my dad. And so I think in realizing that I have a Heavenly Father like that, who will forgive me, never leave me, never forsake me, that can be an anchor amidst the storm, even when we do lose, for example, somebody that was very important to us.
Even if you had a good relationship with your loved one, he or she may have died before you resolved an argument.
If so, perhaps you struggle with regrets.
I suppose that everybody has a few regrets when someone that's very close to you dies. You know, I wish I had expressed more of my love and concern for that person. I wish I would have taken more time to visit and not have been so busy with my life. And sometimes, you know, I really treated this person wrong. Once in a while, it's the last words I said were in anger. Sometimes it's even deeper than that. But it's important to realize that we cannot go back and we can't redo it.
Maybe a person had a really pretty happy and healthy relationship, but the person died suddenly and there may have been a little argument or some misunderstanding in the morning when that person left for work. And often a person feels so regretful and so guilty that why didn't I tell that person I loved him, and why didn't we solve that before he or she went off to work? And I think it's important for the person to also be able to look at what was the normal course of solving those things in a relationship, and to begin to have some trust and confidence that, you know, if he or she would have lived, we would have worked that out just like we worked out all other conflicts. And then to be able to eventually get to the point of letting that go.
If your relationship ended poorly, you may feel guilty or bitter. Forgiving as God forgives and accepting His forgiveness are keys to moving forward.
Let's make sure you understand what God says forgiveness is and how He's demonstrated it.
So forgiveness is canceling a debt. Someone has sinned against you, you cancel the debt, and the implication there is that you're absorbing the cost. So you're not going to bring it up to yourself and dwell on it. Promise two, you're not going to bring it up to other people and make the person pay by gossiping about them. And you're not going to bring it up to them in an inappropriate way and continue to make them pay for the offense.
While forgiveness is easy to understand, you may find it difficult to do, especially when it involves someone who's died.
This advice may help.
Forgiveness is always part of grieving. First of all, you usually have to ask God to forgive you for something that you did or said that wasn't right to the person who died. Then often you have to forgive your departed one for having treated you really bad or having done something really bad against you.
If a loved one sinned against me, they died before I was able to approach them so that we couldn't have horizontal reconciliation, there still is an appropriate place for me to forgive that person, even if they're not alive, before God. This person sinned against me. While they're not around anymore, I won't have to deal with them personally. I still, before you, Lord, forgive this person for what they've done.
Now, that doesn't mean that we condone the action or we say that it's okay, but at least it's a clearing of our own heart and our own conscience to say, I'm not going to hold it against you any longer. I'm going to clear my life and my heart, and I'm going to move on.
If you're struggling with forgiveness, Ask yourself this question.
Could it be that your refusal to forgive your loved one says more about you and the state of your own heart than it says about the one who caused it?
In the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18, Jesus gets to the end of the parable and he says, you know, if you don't forgive, then it's possibly an indication that you haven't experienced God's forgiveness yourself. And I'm not trying to imply that it's not a struggle to forgive. You know, if you struggle to forgive someone, that's an encouraging sign. But there's an outright refusal to forgive other people for minor offenses or even a major offense. If there's an outright refusal to do that, then Jesus is saying, quite possibly what it's showing is that you don't know the forgiveness that was purchased through His life, death, and resurrection.
The Bible says, as Christ has forgiven you, you're to forgive other people. God is perfect, and He forgave me. Who am I to say, well, I'm not going to forgive that other person. He doesn't deserve it. I didn't deserve to be forgiven by God. That person gets my forgiveness whether or not he or she deserves it.
If you need forgiveness for wronging your deceased loved one, we have good news and bad news. Here's the bad news.
Your loved one can't forgive you anymore.
That once the person dies, the ability to seek forgiveness from that person is gone. But one, remind yourself, my salvation, my relationship with God isn't dependent upon this. And it's a place where you experience regret. I wish I would have done that. I wish I would have pursued forgiveness with this person.
The best thing to do is to say, Lord, forgive me. Forgive me for all these things. And really accept God's forgiveness. I found myself a couple times praying after my mom passed away. Lord, Mom's in heaven, and I wish I could tell her this. Please tell it to her. And I don't think that was a wrong prayer. But I also think that we should learn something from this to apply to everyday life, and that is, how do we treat the people that are still with us?
Now here's the good news. If your loved one is in heaven, he or she has nothing but love for you. How do we know this?
According to the Bible, God perfects those who go to heaven. So if your loved one is in heaven, he or she is perfect, and a perfect person can't hold a grudge.
Even though we're instructed to forgive, doing so doesn't mean that we will never wrestle with bitterness or anger.
That's why it's important to remember that forgiveness is a process.
I make a choice, I make a decision through the empowering grace of Christ to forgive someone, but I'm going to continue to struggle possibly after I've made that commitment, because I don't just simply forget what's been done to me. And depending on the severity of what's been done to me, that's going to determine how easy it is for me to not think about it regularly.
Before we move on, we want to share one last thought about forgiveness.
Overemphasizing forgiveness as a process or an event can impede true forgiveness from occurring.
When you fail to understand forgiveness as an event and as a process, you can move in two very different directions. One is the direction of guilt. I thought I forgave this person. I'm still remembering the hurt that they caused me. And they may think, oh, I haven't forgiven them, because if I've really forgiven them, then I wouldn't have these thoughts. The other direction is you can move in the direction of bitterness, but you don't even know it, because you were continuing to hold on to things that you thought you had forgiven.
Lewis Smedes, who's written a lot on forgiveness, was asked the question, how do you know when you've forgiven another person? You've forgiven the other person when in your heart you begin to wish them well. You ask God's blessing upon them. And if it's a person who has died, it's a matter of maybe even saying to the person, I forgive you now. Writing them a letter of forgiveness and reading it at the gravesite. And see, forgiveness isn't necessarily letting the other person off the hook. Forgiveness is sort of coming to peace with ourselves and bringing a healing to us. Because if we don't forgive, that means we're carrying resentment and bitterness, and that begins to eat away at our body and our mind. And so forgiveness is not just for the other person, but it's for us as well. And it's also fulfilling what we've been asked to do in the New Testament.
Prosecutors use fingerprints to bring criminals to justice.
Sometimes those of us who are grieving wish we could fingerprint some of the people who try to comfort us so we could use their prints to prosecute them for cruel and unusual encouragement.
Some of them will say, well, you know, you're not the only one that has lost a husband. You've got to get out of it. Yeah.
How does that feel?
That makes you feel kind of bad.
People would say, we're praying for you, or I'm trying to think, maybe if you need to just trust in God, and I think some days I wanted to stand up and say, I know that. I got that part, okay? I know I'm supposed to trust in God. I know that I'm supposed to do that, and it still feels just as bad as it felt yesterday.
At Myron's funeral, a woman came through and she said, well, she said, at least you won't have to potty train him. And I thought, oh, dear lady, I potty trained 10 2-year-olds if I could have my son back. And that was really, really hurtful, and it made me angry. But I talked with her later because I felt she should know that those kind of things are not acceptable to say to a grieving mother. And she asked forgiveness, and we have a good relationship.
Well, God needed another smile in his garden. And I said, so he could give us a frown down here? To me it didn't make sense that God would take someone so that they could see their smiling face.
Some of your friends won't understand what you're going through.
And others won't have time for you.
As common as this is, it doesn't make it any less painful.
You just didn't feel like anybody could understand. And I think a lot of the emptiness, it's a pain that is so earth-shaking that it's really, really hard to even describe to someone.
I did feel sometimes when the pastor was preaching, and he preached like he always preached, sometimes I felt like, you don't understand, Pastor, you don't understand how it is. But he did, but he couldn't preach, directly to me. And I had a couple of Sunday school teachers that took things in the wrong way. I think maybe they thought that I was trying to get sympathy or empathy, or I don't know if you would even call it notoriety out of this, because, this is something that doesn't happen often. 2 people losing 2 parents at one time.
What's worse than insensitive remarks from your friends? People who misuse the Bible to comfort you. This can leave you feeling guilty for grieving. A verse someone may have misapplied to your situation is Romans 8:28.
It reads like this: we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.
If there's any passage that everybody knows, it's Romans 8:28. And I suspect people who have gone through bereavement have heard it before and they've hated it. Okay? In the midst of suffering, God is doing this good work in our lives. Well, it doesn't feel good, and it doesn't feel like something you should be thankful for, and people use it as, we should be thankful for everything. Everything works together for good.
As if to say that Romans 8:28 is a kind of band-aid that should cause us to wipe our tears away and not grieve anymore. I don't believe it was given for that purpose at all. I want to suggest to you that the key word in Romans 8:28 is the word good. For we know that all things work together for good. As soon as I say that, a question arises. How can you say that the death of a child is good? May I say to you, those things are not good.
Romans 8:29 gives away the passage a little bit more. It tells us what the good is. The good is we're going to be looking more and more like Jesus Christ. Well, here's the problem for me. There are times in the midst of suffering where the only good I can imagine would be the alleviation of my suffering, would be the resurrection of the one that I lost. That's the only thing I can imagine that's good. But apparently there is an even greater good, that somehow the Spirit of the living God is going to make me look more and more like the person I was intended to be.
What God does is He uses tragedy, heartbreak, and difficulty as part of that shaping process to make us and mold us into the image of Jesus Christ. So in that sense, Romans 8:28 is true. He uses the worst things that happen to bring about that which is good, the shaping of the character of Jesus Christ.
Somehow, what I need is the body of Christ in the midst of my bereavement to remind me, to help me to believe that that is good. And I want them to pray for me. I've asked people to pray these things for me in the midst of hardship at times. Could you pray that I would truly believe that being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ is the greatest thing in life?
Remember, Bible verses are not pain relievers, so reading them won't automatically remove your pain.
Instead, God's Word helps to put your pain in the context of His own story. It reminds you that there is purpose and meaning in your suffering, and gives you confidence that the day is coming when death and suffering will cease. After our daughter Hope died, we were surprised that some of the very people we thought would be close to us seemed to disappear.
You've probably experienced similar disappointments with some of your friends and family.
It's really hard to share you've lost a child. Most people become very dumbfounded when you tell them. They become very silent. They're so afraid they're going to make you feel worse. Some people even separate themselves from you. They're really uncomfortable by it. You know, like you have cooties or you're going to jinx them into losing a child. I mean, it's amazing the gamut of responses you get from people.
There's only a select handful of friends that want to acknowledge what we've gone through, and everyone sympathizes and understands, but this is a hard thing, a very hard thing to be brought back to. This is why people retreat.
So why are people so insensitive?
One reason is many people have never dealt with grief firsthand, so they're unable to empathize with you.
I think the people around us don't understand grief unless they've been through it themselves. And they think it's like everything else in our society. It can be fixed quick. We can go through it quick because that is the theme of our society. Have it now, have it over with, let's move on. It's not only that, but they're uncomfortable because you're not the same person. You're not responding the same way. I'd like you back the way you were. And so whether they say it or not, they'd like to fix you. And if they see you smiling at work, they say, oh good, you're getting back to your old self. Whereas that smile might be just for the moment, it might be a pretense, but they don't know how deeply you're hurting inside. As one person has shared with me time and time again, Norm, at work, they just don't get it. They just don't understand. It's like I have to explain to them every month, here's where I am. And they say, oh, it's like they don't remember.
Here's another reason your friend, family member, or your spouse may not be able to comfort you.
Doing so would force that person to confront his or her own grief.
My wife, for an example, when her grandmother died, I was like, hey, she's dead, let's get over it. And it hurt her that I responded that way, but out of my own hurt, because I didn't want to touch anything with grief because I know it's going to stir something up in me in that area. And it hurt my relationship with my wife when she was grieving her grandmother.
One of the most painful things I experienced in my grief was receiving a letter from an old friend who sharply criticized how we dealt with Hope's life and death, accusing us of not really loving her. It felt like a punch in the stomach, and my instinct was to defend myself. But as I thought about it, I realized that his desire to hurt me came out of his own deep pain, and I began to feel sad for him, that the pain of his life is so great that he would reach out to hurt me at the lowest point in my life.
You see, hurt people hurt other people. And some of the people who are guilty of treating you harshly need your forgiveness and understanding.
When I'm tempted to condemn others for being callous, I remind myself that before Hope died, I oftentimes avoided people who experienced a loss. I figured that there were so many people speaking to them that they wouldn't realize that I hadn't said anything to them. But now I realize that you do remember who has said something and who hasn't.
I'm just as guilty. And truth be told, before you suffered loss, you were probably just as clueless about the pain of grief as some of your friends are now. You may have avoided a grieving coworker, a church member, or maybe you spoke words of comfort that actually caused someone pain.
I remember one day in the hallway at church, a woman actually came up to me, took me by the shoulders and shook me and said, "You need to cry." And I wanted to yell at her, "I cry all the time," but I didn't, I went on. But I avoided her for a while. I was just upset with her, and when I'd see her, I'd kind of walk the other way. And then I stopped and I thought, what, she meant well. She didn't realize what she was doing and how invasive it was. And I just need to let that go. I need to release it. I don't need to tell her, and I need to not avoid her and be kind to her, because people do mean well. They're very uncomfortable and they don't know what to say. So sometimes they just, they put their foot in their mouth and they don't mean it, and we need to be gracious and say thanks and go on.
If your friends or comforters have wronged you, you shouldn't hold a grudge against them.
Instead, you need to forgive them.
I think forgiveness is very important during the grieving process. For me, sometimes when people didn't know what to do, so they didn't do anything or didn't say anything, or maybe had said something that was a quick fix or that was hurtful to me, I realized that that could be a stumbling block to my healing of going through the grief process. So that is something that I had to realize that was part I needed to forgive them to move on. And I have talked to other people where they really did get stuck there because they were so hurt that they didn't grieve. They were stuck in people being insensitive and the church not being understanding. So the forgiveness part is very important for us to continue to allow God to heal us.
When we're offended, it's easy to focus on what was done to us. But when we do that, we fail to see our contribution to our problems.
So before you lash out at a coworker or vow to never speak to your best friend again, make sure your expectations of your comforters are realistic.
In 1981, Rick Billingsley's wife, Marcia, was killed in a car accident.
We were struck broadside by a drunk driver at an intersection here in town, and everyone in the vehicle was injured, and she died from her injuries.
The accident left Rick in a coma for 6 weeks. When he came out of it, he learned that he'd lost more than his wife.
I actually lost part of myself. I lost all of myself. After the coma, I could not remember very much. I had to learn everything, just like a little baby learns things.
While Rick was in the hospital, his in-laws moved in to take care of his daughters. In the course of making themselves at home, they rearranged the home. When Rick returned home, he was shocked.
I started trying to recover. I could remember very, very little about my former life. And I was sure that walking into the house and seeing how things were set up for me and my wife, that would help me remember things. So I blame them, besides God, for my memory not returning like I thought it should.
For 20 years, Rick held a grudge against his in-laws. God used Grief Share to give Rick a different perspective on his in-laws' actions.
20 years after the accident, 20 years of not caring, or rather not understanding how they felt, I finally went to the Grief Share class and learned many things about how different people react to grief. They were dealing with their emotions of losing their daughter, and I was unaware of that at the time. So when I came home, I was all concerned about me. And so after taking the grief share class, I felt I had to call them and apologize for the way I treated them and talk to them about it and try to explain to them why. And then, after that, our relationship got better.
As we just saw, over time, Rick realized that his expectations of his family members were wrong. And after some reflection, you may come to the same conclusion.
A list of signs that indicate you may be expecting too much of others is at the end of this week's workbook exercises.
Once you know that your expectations are reasonable, communicate them to others. One way to do this is with a grief letter.
A grief letter isn't the only way to express your needs, but it does keep you from having to repeat yourself.
If you'd like more information on how to write a grief letter, see the end of this section's exercises.
With so many people asking you, "How are you doing?" it may seem easiest to just say, "I'm fine," and move on.
But H. Norman Wright advises that this isn't the best way to respond to the inquiries of others.
When people ask you how you're doing, one of the best things not to say is the word fine, because they will interpret that a dozen different ways differently than perhaps you mean it. In fact, one of the things that we like to do when we ask a person in grief, "How are you doing?" and they say fine, we come back and say, "But how are you really doing?" And then they realize you want to hear, don't you? So when somebody asks you how you're doing, be honest. "I'm having a difficult day. I've really been struggling today. Today, on a scale of 0 to 10, I'm probably at a 3, and I appreciate you asking where I'm at." Be honest.
Sometimes you get so frustrated that you dump your problems on other people.
This is often done to make others feel bad, but it isn't a good move.
Blurting the truth out and really trying to bury somebody with the truth probably isn't a really good thing, because what you're really doing is using them as a lightning rod for your own frustration and your own anger. I think it's very important to be honest. So if somebody says, "How are you doing?" I used to then get to the point of saying, "Are you just asking, or do you really want to know?" Because if you really want to know, then let's sit down and I'll tell you how I'm doing. Otherwise, I'll simply say, "Well, it's not a good day. I'm feeling pretty badly today," or "I'm very sad," or "I had a better day yesterday, but I don't know how it's going to go today." And to respond in at least some simple but truthful ways, rather than simply shrugging it off and saying, "I'm okay."
A few weeks after our daughter Hope died, I was walking from one building at our church to another, right past the nursery. Just then, 4 women with babies born around the time Hope was born came walking toward me. And I'm not sure who wanted to turn around and run the other direction more, them or me.
During your grief, you will often find yourself in awkward situations. When you do, you have 3 options. First, you can let everyone walk on eggshells around you.
But this isn't fair. Just because you've lost your loved one doesn't give you the right to steal joy from those who haven't.
Second, you can wait for them to do or say the right thing.
This is also unfair, because it puts them in the position of having to read your mind. And since your grief is so unique, it's unlikely that anyone will know exactly what you need said or done.
Third, you can extend yourself and try to make people comfortable around you. This is the best choice.
You may think it's unfair that you have to make others comfortable. And honestly, it is. But by now we've learned that life isn't fair, haven't we? That day at my church, I realized it was up to me to let these other moms know that I wasn't going to avoid them. But in fact, I wanted to enjoy them and their children. So I stopped and I spoke with one of the women and stroked her child's hair as the other women walked by. And honestly, then I went to my car and cried.
Making others comfortable isn't going to be easy, but in time you'll see that the benefits outweigh the alternatives.
But keep in mind that when your grief is fresh, you may not have the energy to reach out and make others comfortable, and that's okay. But as your strength returns, you'll be better able to do so. In fact, you'll find that making people comfortable is what actually helps you move forward in your grief.
As forensic science has advanced, scientists have discovered that fingerprints tell us more than a person's identity. They reveal if the prints belong to a smoker, a heroin, or a cocaine addict. Some scientists can even use fingerprints to make an informed guess about a person's age.
During this session, to help you understand that your grief is unique, we've asked you to think of your grief as a fingerprint. And we hope you've learned how unresolved conflict and insensitive counsel can complicate your grief.
But taking the analogy of your grief being like a fingerprint one step further, ask yourself, what can others learn about me by the way I'm grieving? More importantly, what can I learn about myself?
In the coming weeks, we'll try to help you answer those questions. For now, it's important to be aware that you can learn a great deal from your grief, and others will too.
If you want to hear from others who are learning from their grief, sign up for our free email devotionals.
Each day, you'll hear from others who have reflected upon their journey of grief and are the better for it. For more information on how to sign up for your free daily email devotional, talk to your group leader or log on to our website, griefshare.org.
In the next session of Grief Share, we'll discover God's prescription for grief.
Facing pain obviously hurts, but pushing it down, it doesn't make it go away.
Be honest with God. You know, we tend to try to fake Him out. You know, I'm angry at Him for a reason, something didn't work out, you know, someone died, someone's sick, but then I'll go into prayer and I go, oh, I love you, Father, I praise you, Father. I think He just sits up there and He laughs.
Weep freely, share your anguish, your heartache, your sorrow, but always with the joyful assurance, Jesus is with you.
Don't miss the next session of Grief Share.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.